All right. Good afternoon. We got a pretty full house. As normal, ADA takes like 4 or 5 days to present on anything, so you're going to have to listen fast, and we'll try and get through a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to kind of focus today a little bit, if I hit the right button. We're going to focus a little bit on what is an ADA transition plan, what makes it up, how to get one, and a couple of resources on where to find information on it. So if you've got questions that you brought in about ADA transition plans, great. We'll try and save those for the end. But if you just can't wait as we get to it, bring it up and we'll talk as we go. We may miss the general session at the end if we talk too much, but I've got a lot of slides to get through. Just a few examples. We're going to talk about ADA. How does it apply to your project? We'll talk about the self-evaluation part of the transition plan. The transition plan itself is just a small little document on the end. We'll get to that. And we'll talk about some of the challenges about developing a transition plan. Why is it so difficult? Why has it taken so long for us to get to this point to talk about transition plans? So we got to start from the basics here. ADA is a civil rights law. It's really not about engineering, although engineering's tied up in it. But it's a civil rights law. It's an anti-discrimination, and it's about removal of barriers. It's enforced by the Department of Justice and attorneys at that level from DC. So entities have tried to negotiate different things and all of that, but it's a pretty high level of expectation in the federal law, and the Department of Justice elevates that expectation as well. So we're looking at a civil rights law. It's not new. Started in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, and several amendments and laws since then. And it kind of depends on where you're working at. If you're in a building, you're going to talk about Architectural Barriers Act. If you're out on the right-of-way, you're going to talk about PROAG, Public Rights-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. So it depends on where you're at, and if you're doing a transition plan for your community, you're going to be dealing with both of those, buildings and facilities outside and sites. So it takes a knowledge of both of those to really make a good transition plan and the self-evaluation that goes with it. The Americans with Disabilities Act from 1990 actually made it official that it applies to every community across the country, no matter what, under Title II of that. It also applied to private places of public accommodation, that mom and pop bakery shop that really didn't apply under the Architectural Barriers Act or the Rehabilitation Act because those were federal places. The ADA law applied it to them as well. So as of 1990, basically everybody's following under the same rules, but it's a different title in the law itself. From there, we came out with a public right-of-way guidance, PROAG, to tell us how to deal with things once you leave the building, because things change a little bit. The construction in the real world outside of a building is quite a bit different than what it is inside the building. So there's actually a different rule book for that. Technically, that rule book has not been approved by the Department of Justice and is not letter of the law, but it is best practice at this point. If you want to talk letter of the law, you have to build your sidewalks and everything outside, just like you do the floors and the hallways inside a building. If you want to try and make that argument that I'm only going to follow the law, I'm not going to follow PROAG. PROAG gives you lots of great examples and exceptions so you can actually build things outside of buildings in the real world. Yeah. Yes?
So since it hasn't been adopted, if you follow PROAG standards for your infrastructure and then they change them and adopt them 2 years from now, are you still sort of, yeah? Great
question. All right, so if you choose to follow the PROAG now, I'm going to restate your question, and they change it in the future, are you given what they call an ADA safe harbor? So technically, we don't know that answer until they publish the new rule and approve it to know whether or not they will grant safe harbor for those. In the past, they always have. If you followed a previous standard 100%, you were given safe harbor until you made the next alteration. So in the past, they did. In the future, until they publish the new rule and adopt it, we don't know for sure. But we think if you follow PROAG from 2005, you will be grandfathered in the future. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say grandfathered, that's not in there. Safe harbored in the future. So there's been a new rule written for public right-of-ways after 2005. It was accepted by Federal Highway as a best practice, the 2005 version, and for me it's this ratty-tatty paper copy. They published a new version in 2011. It's a little bit different. They've found a few things they didn't like in 2005 and they tweaked it a little bit more. This version is what the Access Board from Washington, D.C. will ask you to follow, but it has not been approved by anyone, including Federal Highway. Federal Highway still supports the 2005 version as their best practice. So at MoDOT, up until this point, we have always chosen to follow 2005 PROAG because Federal Highway, people who give us the money and approve our plans and all that good stuff, have adopted this as the best practice. So we have not, as an organization at MoDOT, gone to 2011 yet. However, if there are things that are unclear or wrong in this book, we can go here and look for clarification of what the intent has changed to. But there's also a lot of things in 2011 that probably aren't going to make it to the final ruling because they're way above and beyond what any of us can afford and really intend to do. So we're going to talk basically out of PROAG from 2005. The 2011 version, they've been talking about they're going to approve it again in 12, 13, 14, 15. They still have not approved it yet. And with the current status of the administration and ruling about you got to get rid of 2 rules to adopt 1 new one. And is this 1 rule or 500? We don't know, but it's probably not going to get approved this year either. We'll see what happens in the future. But PROAG from 05 or 11, they're very similar. But 05 is what we're going to choose to follow from here. Got to back up. All right. Before ADA was Section 504. The Rehabilitation Act, Section 504. Basically what it said was if you take any federal money in your organization anywhere, you have to comply with Section 504 in the Rehabilitation Act. It's like a drop of red dye in that pitcher of water. 1 drop is all it takes to taint all of that money. So if your organization has ever touched federal money, 504 applies to you in what's called program access. The entirety of your program, services, activities, all have to be accessible to all people, people with disabilities. You're not allowed to discriminate against them or exclude them from participation or deny them benefits or programs. That's the civil rights part of the law. So that's why they're looking at this one in an even bigger magnifying glass. Section 504 already set those standards. As a nation, we might have been a little bit slow adopting them and getting to them. So ADA in 1990 picked that up and expanded that a little bit more and put a little bit more teeth behind it, a little bit more focus. So there's several coinciding laws and things going on here about ADA and the transition plans that we're talking about today. There are 4 pretty major goals in here that they're talking about: equal opportunity, full participation, about independent living, and about economic self-sufficiency. They actually have this dream that everybody's going to be able to get in and do everything and do all this by 1995. The law was passed in 1990. We ought to be able to fix everything in the country by 1995. Yeah, that didn't work out quite so well. One of the other things we need to think about as we look at ADA is it's not an equality law. It's about equity, about how we apply things. So the little cartoon here, they don't all get the same size box. They get the box they need to get to that same point of equity. So some people may not need accommodation at all, and that's great. Some people may need a little bit of help, and some people may need a whole lot of help. It's about that individual and their participation. We have to decide how much help that person needs to be that member of society that can participate and be self-sufficient. Okay? So it's not give everybody the same treatment. This is treat everybody so they can get to the same level. All right, questions there? Good. How does it apply to your project? Why does it apply to your project? A little about the legal background. How many lawyers in the room? We got a couple? Thank you. I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. I will not claim to be. But there are three main cases we're going to talk about today real quick about why ADA matters and what we have to do. The first one is Kinney versus Jerusalem from 1993. ADA passed in 1990, took effect with projects in 1992, and the lawsuit came out in 1993. Basically, it said you have to do these four things. You have to provide curb ramps or sloped areas anywhere that pedestrian route intersects with the roadway. You have to remove that barrier to access, and you have to add detectable warnings in that same location. If you make it smoother, safer for people who can afford to drive or choose to drive, you have to make it smoother and safer for those who can't drive, won't drive, choose not to, can't afford to. You have to provide that same access to that roadway, to that right-of-way space, to those with disabilities as you do with those that drive the vehicles. So this law come back, this is the curb ramp part of the law in ADA that's confirmed by the courts. You have to provide access between the pedestrian space and the roadway so people can get across that space. The second one is the sidewalk maintenance case out of Barden versus Sacramento. Basically, Barden alleged, hey, you built these sidewalks, you got to maintain these. This is part of what you're doing for us, that's great, but you have to maintain those in the future. Sacramento answered back and said, hey, this is not a program or a service or an activity, this is just something we do. They didn't make a very good argument, and as such, it came back pretty quick that sidewalks were found by the courts to actually, yes, be a program, a service, or an activity. They are covered by ADA. You do have to maintain them once they've been built. In fact, in their opinion, they said ADA would be meaningless if it was just about curb ramps. ADA is actually about the sidewalk in between them and the accessibility between those curb ramp points. So it takes the Kinney ruling and goes that next step. It's not just curb ramps and crosswalks. It's about the connections between those curb ramps and crosswalks as well. So here's kind of an example about the Barden case is they resurfaced the roadway. They realized they had to do something about that barrier at the curb line in this close corner, but they chose not to do anything about the sidewalk to get to it. This is what the Barden case is about. You have to fix that piece of sidewalk too. It's not just about the curb ramps, it's about the whole system being usable. And it's about the cross the street piece that didn't get the curb ramp. Barden case was looking so bad, the city of Sacramento settled it before it got to finding in court, and they settled for 20% of their transportation funds over the next 30 years. That's not their construction funds, that's their entire baseline budget. So at MoDOT, that would be the $1 billion budget, not the $600 or $800 million construction budget. That's what they settled for because they were afraid the court case was going to be much worse. That also has become the standard baseline. If you get into an ADA problem, that's where they start their negotiations from the Department of Justice. 20% of your big budget till these problems go away. It gets pretty big in a hurry. Lomberg was another one. Very significant case in this. It's been argued and tried and opinioned and back and forth. But basically the courts have come back and said because the city failed to construct curb ramps after Mr. Lomberg had asked for them for over 10 years, he would go back to the city and say, hey, I need help at this intersection, this curb ramp. I need help here, over here to get into the water company so I can pay my water bill. You want me to pay my water bill, don't you? You should make it accessible so I can get in there. And they said the court opinion came back and said, hey, you're denying him the ability to live his life if you don't put in these couple of curb ramps. By the way, you owe him some money. So they awarded him actually cash awards for his damages for 10 years of work trying to get in and get these things fixed. So the city had to pay him damages under Section 504, plus they still have to go out and make the corrections. So the lesson learned for us is it's a lot easier and a lot more cost effective for us to make those corrections when they're notified to us, when they bring those complaints to us, than it is to try and fight it, because you're going to have to make the fix anyway, and you may have to pay penalties in the court system as well. So when those complaints come up, you want to jump on those pretty quickly. Again, ADA is a civil rights law. It gives protections to certain people with disabilities in certain classes when it relates to their options and their opportunity to participate in public events, programs, and services. Civil rights law gives them protection in all these different areas: education, housing, healthcare. Even the size of print that goes on the internet websites is now controlled by that. ADA rules. So it comes down to time for us to choose. Are we going to keep doing things the way we've done, or are we going to make that change and accept our responsibility as providing transportation to those, providing public facilities? Or are we going to make that step and we're going to go forward? For state and local governments, we're covered under Title II and again under Section 504. Two different laws: ADA Title II, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act 1973. But we've got the requirement to operate each activity, each service, so that when viewed in its entirety, everything we do, that it's accessible to people with disabilities. So for a meeting like this today, if we're going to have a meeting upstairs, there needs to be an elevator so people can get to that meeting. That's one of those things we're talking about. If not, we need to be able and willing to relocate that meeting to a ground level floor so people with disabilities can attend just the same. So it could be as simple as just changing the room number of the city council hearing. It could be as extensive as building an elevator and providing access to that upper level court hearing room. Depends on what it is and where we go. Three basic steps in Title II compliance. Title II again is public agencies, cities, counties, states. Self-evaluation is the first part. You take inventory of what you've got, what's good and what's not, and you make a big long list of things that don't meet ADA compliance. The second step is the actual transition plan, which is where you take that big long list, you figure out what you're going to do to make those pieces compliant, you put a schedule of when you're going to make those fixes and a budget, and you publish that to the people in your community to comment and let them adjust your schedules, your timelines on it. This project's more important than that one. It should be bumped up. You got to go through the public input process. And then the hard part, the actual physical modifications. Now, under the 1990 ADA law, those were supposed to be done by January 26, 1995. So we're a little behind. So we got to get it a little bit faster. Well, the problem for a lot of us is we don't even know what that involves. Where do we go? What do we do? So we've got meetings like this. So let's talk a little bit about self-evaluation and get to a few basics. It's not just the concrete of the sidewalk and the curb ramp, but it's also about the policies, the services the community offers, about the communications it offers about those things. So it even deals with a police officer making a traffic stop to someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. The city has to have a plan about how to communicate with that individual. If they make a stop and they can't actually communicate with the person and they realize that there's a hearing problem, they're already supposed to have a list of interpreters online ready to go. That's part of the self-evaluation, and the transition plan gives them the number of the people to call when they need that help. It also includes buildings, programs, including the right-of-way that we're most familiar with here at MoDOT. And there's a YouTube video out there, very good, about Federal Highway, pretty recent publication on self-evaluations and how to do those. Simply put, you got to evaluate what you've got, find out what your defects are, get the public comments so you can help prioritize those fixes, schedule those fixes, and then go do the fixes. If you're interested in reading the legal part, here it is. I won't focus on it too long. That 35105 and other parts talk about that. What you have to do and what the timeline is, and if you don't meet those timelines, which none of us did, you have to have a plan on when you're going to do those things. One of the questions I often get is, well, what about this 50 persons or more, 50 employees? My city doesn't employ 50 people, so that doesn't apply to us. Not exactly correct. ADA law applies to all of the communities, all of the Title II agencies. The agencies that have 50 or more employees, and that's temporary, that's part-time, that's people who volunteer, people who are elected officials, that is total body count that it takes to do everything the city does. That's volunteer umpires at Little League, that's people who do the janitor work in the courthouse, that's everything, paid or not paid. So it doesn't take much to get to that 50 head count. Any community that hits that 50 head count has additional responsibilities, or communities that don't have 50 have a couple of lesser. They don't have to keep records for quite so long, they don't have to have quite as many public hearings, but they still have to comply with all of the ADA law. So it's the same law for all of us, no matter where we're at. If you've got 50 or more employees, there's a couple of other things you have to do. So there's not an exception, there's not a get out of ADA clause at 49 employees or less. Sorry to break that bubble today. Required of all entities, identify those barriers, review your policies, look at non-discrimination, and look at your public involvement comments and your prioritizations they may give you. You have to have that effective communications plan, not just at the big level, but at that street level with that officer or with those agents doing work at the desk at the water department. And you've got to have employee training about what things you can do and can't do. So there's a lot of work here. The goal is to provide equal access to the maximum extent feasible. I may not be able to build an elevator on this building, but I can move that public meeting down to the first floor. So it may not actually cost you anything to comply, but you got to look at the review of the policies, practices, and procedures to see if you still need to make those changes. In the public right-of-way, you got to look at the curbs, the sidewalks, the pedestrian crossings and signals, parking lots. The number of marked parking spaces has a ratio in the law about how many of those have to be accessible and marked for handicap use only. Bus stops, parks, and then you add on top of that all of the barriers within the facilities. So it's lots and lots of stuff covered here. The ADA compliance class, it takes a long time to get a good handle on that. But basically we sum it up in 2.5 and 8.33 and then a whole bunch of other stuff you tack onto that. We've got several opportunities. We've done classes on that before and we can do more. But that's kind of the basis of the engineering side about what does it take to be compliant with ADA. And we can talk more about that at the end if we have time. Part of the big problem on the national scale is people know part of the rule but not all of it. So what do you think about this location? Does it make sense to you? Now, somebody drew the plans up for this, somebody approved it, somebody went out and built it, and somebody went out and inspected it after it was built and said, hey, looks good to me, I'll pay you for that. And left that. Okay, you do have to have curb ramps at your accessible aisles in the parking spaces, but at the top of those ramps, you also have to have a landing or resting space. And then you can start the next ramp. Well, there's no landings in between those. Frankly, this just really looks bad. Somebody goofed here. But this is the kind of thing you see all over the place. Somebody that made an attempt, they knew part of the rule, but not enough to make it a good, accessible piece. So we can do better than this. One part that we often forget is the public input part. Which one of these intersections in town is the most important to people with disabilities? May not know. What we find is in big communities with transit, there's often a transit stop by a major medical facility that gets the most comments from the public. When I have to go because of my disability to the doctor, I get on the bus and I go to this facility and I need from there to there fixed. For me, that may not ever register on my radar because I may not even go to that community living in that town, that part of that neighborhood. That's why the public involvement process is so important for us. It's impossible for any one of us to know all of those possible needs. The public involvement process brings those all to the table. Where do you need this accommodation? Where do you need that? Where can we make things better? Put those in, put them in the mix, run them through the process, and prioritize those fixes. The self-evaluation part really looks at all of those public pieces. The policies, procedures, all that stuff, and the physical place. The transition plan gets out that microscope and digs a little bit deeper. It's not just how much is wrong, what's wrong, what do I have to do to make a fix here, how much time and effort and expense is that going to cost, and then prioritize those. So this is kind of where we get into the planning part of things. We know what the needs are to get fixed. We know cost estimates. We know work effort it's going to take. The transition plan takes those, ranks those priorities out, puts them on a public document. We send it out, we get our comments and say, did we prioritize these correctly? Is there some things that need to shift? Some things are more important than what we've given them priority here. The transition plan lists those documents, gets things on. It also tracks and reports progress over time. So as you make a completed project, as you complete something, that transition plan is where you take credit for it and you show it as completed and you put the big check mark on it, completed as promised. So it helps with our accountability and our transparency as we go forward with other projects. Without this, if you find yourself in an accessibility lawsuit, you haven't got a document to show self-evaluation, prioritization, and progress. At that point, you're basically at the mercy of the courts. How much do we have to do to make sure you understand these things you have to do, and you have to track your progress and be accountable for it? This is your single best defense against those kind of cases. Have a plan, show some progress. It may take quite a while. We're well beyond 1995, aren't we? But having this document that's required under the federal law in place, a living document as we go, is really our best defense to show our progress and our knowledge of the situation, our acceptance of the requirement of the work it takes to finish. So the transition plan really takes those pieces, all of the facilities under our control here at MoDOT, and you find that sidewalk on the left-hand picture there is actually a sidewalk I found on a field check looking at something else. Do you think we might need to look at that, do a little maintenance there? How does it prioritize in the system? It hasn't to this point. But as we look at our system in whole, we realize that piece needs some attention. So in the planning process, we look at those on each project at the MoDOT level. We got to look at how they operate, what's missing, any gaps we may be able to address as we're there. It is quite long and lengthy. A lot of things to remember, and I hate slides with that many words on it, so forgive me. But it's a living document. Transition plan is the list of things we got to do, how we're going to do it, how we estimate the costing on it, and then check mark. That one's done, that one's done, that one's done. As a community, you need to think about as you bring on new developments within your community or as you expand your boundaries, that means you have to go back and modify that transition plan. There's going to be new work there that may or may not be compliant. Especially on the new construction, the new developments, you need to have a focus on those to make sure they're built right before you accept the maintenance on them. There's nothing worse than having a new subdivision come in and build bad sidewalk and it immediately goes on your to-do list and cost you money to fix because we didn't take the time to inspect it and get it built right the first time. The biggest black eye we get from the public is, that's a brand new sidewalk. Why are you tearing it out and fixing it? Well, we didn't do our inspections correctly in the first spot. That's why we have to go back and fix it. A little bit of inspection time is well worth the time and effort. We need to remember that one. We also have to look at special requests and we have to address complaints as they come up. Complaints you do not address can go on to DC and come back through the Department of Justice. And those become much more difficult and much more focused in your response and your progress on your transition plan. And if you don't have one, it becomes very quickly apparent. So you need to look at those things. New construction is of course required to be 100% compliant. The retrofits, the rebuilds, the resurfacings, maximum extent feasible. There is a video from Federal Highway on that as well, and I've given you that link. A couple of videos well worth your time to pull up and give it a look if you're looking at transition plans, self-evaluations. Publications you need to know about. We talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act guidelines. 2010 is the current version of that. The 2005 PROAG is the one we currently use, or the 2011 version is one coming up pretty close. There's also a couple of ADA best practice guides. There's also, with the Department of Justice, Guide for Small Towns, give you a couple of things about advice. There's all kinds of publications out there to get you started. There's no reason why you can't get things going. There's lots of good information out there. So what are some of the challenges about developing your transition plan? Well, you name it. Time, money, staff, right? Self-evaluation, the inventory and that data collection takes time. There's several ways you can do it. You can do it paper, you can do it by GPS, you can do it with automated data collections. There are all kinds of ways. You got to find one that works for you and the magnitude of the work you've got to do. Okay, we're going to couple quick. ADA standards and training, you got to know what's compliant and what's not. Training is an important part. You got to have the resources, time, the money, the people, whatever it takes to make those documents, do those inventories. So there's a lot of things that keep you from it. The hard part really down there at the bottom is that organizational denial. We've been denying its responsibility for so long, we got to break through that wall and get back to it. We've got requirements to get it done. We need to step up and make that part of our work process. When is it important to us? When there's an alteration. That's a legal term and definition in the stuff. But basically in 2013, Federal Highway came back and they put up a list. These projects on the top are maintenance. These projects below are alterations. These automatically trigger ADA compliance. The one we probably need to focus on here is any additional new layer of asphalt. That includes mill and fills, chip seals. No, chip seals are up here in the maintenance side. Any new layer of asphalt triggers ADA compliance. So if you do any resurfacing work, you're going to be there. Challenges to developing it, curb ramps. Is that good enough for you? No. How about that one? Truncated domes. There's a lot of truncated domes out there, but they're not always correct. A little bit of training, you can get those better. Sidewalks. Here's one from the Capitol on the left. Is that wide enough to get through? No, we missed it by that much. Faulted joints. Tree roots all the time are breaking up our sidewalks. Darn trees don't know how important that sidewalk is to it. Maintenance goes on and on. It's not a one and done thing, just like our roadways are not one and done. You got to stay with them on the maintenance. Urban shoulders, I get this question a lot. Is that a sidewalk or is that a shoulder? It depends. That's a good federal answer to that. It depends. If there's any way to get up on that sidewalk for people with disabilities, it's a sidewalk, it has to follow the rules. So whenever someone comes in and breaks this curb and builds a curb ramp, now the whole bubble has to be compliant. If it's not compliant to anyone, if it's barriered off, it can be considered a shoulder. But as soon as it comes in and becomes a sidewalk open, it has to be fully compliant. That definition varies over time. Depending on who you ask, some of them automatically say it's a sidewalk, it has to have ramp. Some of them say only when there is a sidewalk and a ramp. Should you fix that? People that use that for a sidewalk all the time, in Branson and other places. If they're using it for sidewalk, you probably need a sidewalk. Crosswalks. Crosswalks to an island, one of our most common errors in the right-of-way. Pedestrian signals, lots of work to do there. We need to get up to ADA standards in those. And this time of year, I always get to talk about maintenance and snow removal. If you do it for the roadway, for the drivers, you got to do it for the pedestrians as well. That's the expectation under federal law. There are always complex situations. You got to think about all those parts and pieces. Lots of things to do. Work zones. When you're doing the work, you got to think about those as well. Whew. All right, questions? So we got time for 2 questions.
Hey Ron, on the documents that you might get several of up there, is the PROAG for the sidewalks, is the PROAG, does that make
Yes, great question. So of all the documents out there, if we're going to be working on sidewalks outside of buildings, we're going to recommend, of course, using ProAg. That's because it's written for that space. There are exceptions in ProAg that give you the ability to follow the roadway instead of building it like a hallway in a building. Lots of great exceptions in there, make it buildable in the real world. Great, thank you. There are digital copies available of the federal publications. Of this one, we're going to post it on the website. The presentation is going to be available as a PDF on the website for this planning group. So yes, it will be available. Yes?
You said it's an active plan. How often do you have to go back to review to see if?
Great. So an ADA transition plan is active. It's a living document. The question is, how often do you have to update that? A lot of that depends on the size and magnitude of your plan. Here's one developed by the city of Clayton, just pretty much new, hot off the press. It really comes down to how much, the blue lines here are defects and things they got to fix. How much do you have to fix and how often are you making fixes? It really is, the answer is.
Right, that's fixing it, but what happens if, another tree root comes up?
How often is that? And that kind of goes back to how often are you doing that for your roadways? If you've got a 5-year cycle on your roadways, probably a 5-year cycle on your transition plan is a good plan. If you're looking at a 10-year cycle for resurfacing, probably a 10-year cycle. For us at MoDOT, we've got a 17-year plan, and we're looking at roughly a 5-year cycle to look at changing that and reviewing that. So it kind of depends on your plan and how often your cycle for maintenance is. Great question, thank you. All right, general session is next upstairs. Thank you.